Billionaire pretends to sleep to test Black Maid's kid and freezes, seeing what she does. Wealth has a strange way of testing people. Behind the gates of a sprawling mansion, a billionaire, used to controlling everything in his life, devised a cruel little experiment. One evening, instead of leaving for his office as usual, he slipped into bed, closed his eyes, and pretended to sleep. Why? To see how his longtime Black Maid and her young daughter, who sometimes accompanied her, behaved when they thought no one was watching. What he expected was mischief, greed, or betrayal. But what he witnessed in those quiet moments shattered. His assumptions left him frozen in disbelief and exposed an ugly truth he didn't want to face. The mansion stretched across acres of manicured gardens, every corner dripping with wealth. Its owner, Richard Hale, was a man accustomed to suspicion. He had built his fortune through ruthless decisions, never trusting anyone unless they were proven loyal. That mistrust didn't stop at his boardroom. It crept into his household, too. For years, his maid, Gloria, had been a steady presence. A Black woman in her mid-30s, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Despite long hours and demanding tasks, she never complained. Occasionally, she brought her young daughter, Amara, when babysitting fell through. The little girl, barely 8 years old, would sit in the kitchen sketching on scraps of paper while her mother worked. Richard often caught himself watching them, not out of warmth, but curiosity. Could someone in their position, struggling, underpaid, unseen by society, truly be trusted with wealth? He convinced himself people like Gloria only behaved because of rules and consequences, but deep down, he wondered what would happen if the mask slipped. So one evening, Richard staged his own private test. He told Gloria he'd be resting after dinner, then lay fully clothed in his bed, eyes shut, breathing steady, feigning sleep. He left his wallet carelessly on the nightstand, his expensive watch glinting under the lamp, and even left a small safe slightly ajar. As footsteps echoed, faintly down the hallway, Richard's heart raced. He imagined he would finally confirm his belief that, given the chance, everyone's true nature turned selfish. What he didn't know was that the next few moments would not only expose his bias, but reveal a truth about innocence, dignity, and human worth he had never considered before. The house was unusually silent, broken only by the faint ticking of an ornate grandfather clock in the hallway. Richard lay still, his breaths carefully measured, ears straining for the slightest sound. He heard the soft creak of the door opening, then Gloria's footsteps padding lightly into the room. She moved with practiced efficiency, straightening curtains, dusting the dresser, fluffing the pillows at the foot of the bed, all small tasks she performed daily. But Richard's mind focused only on one thing. Would her eyes linger on the wallet, the watch, the safe? From beneath his lashes, he saw her glance briefly toward the nightstand. His pulse quickened. She was close enough to touch it, close enough to slip a bill or tuck away the watch, yet she never broke her rhythm. Instead, she adjusted the blanket at the foot of the bed with quiet care, as though protecting his comfort even in his supposed sleep. Then came the sound of smaller footsteps, barely noticeable but distinct. Amara, her daughter, had followed, her inside. Richard stiffened. This, he thought, was the true test. Children rarely obey boundaries, and to a curious 8-year-old, a glittering watch or stack of cash could look like treasure. Amara tiptoed closer, her eyes wide with fascination. At the enormous room, she stopped near the nightstand, her gaze lingering on the wallet. Richard's heart pounded. This was it. He had staged the perfect trap. A child, unguarded, tempted by wealth she had never known. He was certain her little hands would reach out. But instead, Amara bent over and whispered something so soft Richard almost missed it. "Mama, why does he keep his things out like that? What if someone bad comes?" Gloria hushed her gently, her tone calm but firm. "We take nothing that isn't ours, baby. We respect even when no one's watching. The words struck Richard like a dart. Yet the test wasn't over. He expected Amara's curiosity to overwhelm her. Instead, she turned away from the wallet and busied herself rearranging the books on a nearby shelf, carefully stacking them as if tidying the space. Her small face lit with pride when Gloria nodded approvingly. Richard's chest tightened. This wasn't what he had prepared for. He wanted confirmation of his suspicion, something to justify his quiet disdain. Instead, he saw discipline, dignity, and honesty displayed in its purest form. Still, he waited, frozen in his charade. Minutes stretched painfully. Gloria finished dusting, gathered her supplies, and guided Amara toward the door. Just before leaving, Amara tiptoed back. Richard held his breath, convinced this was the moment. But she didn't touch the wallet. She pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders, just as her mother had, then whispered, "Good night, sir," before slipping out. The door clicked shut, and the silence returned. Richard remained motionless, though his heart thundered. In the stillness, shame crept in. What had he expected? To catch a child stealing? To expose dishonor in someone whose entire life was built on serving others? The reality unsettled him, more than any theft could have. He had set a trap, but it was his own prejudice that had been exposed. Richard lay frozen in the dark, but not from fear of being discovered. What paralyzed him now was the weight of his own shame. He had prepared himself for betrayal, convinced that poverty bred dishonesty, that if given a chance, Gloria or her child would snatch whatever glittered within reach. Instead, they had revealed something far more powerful: integrity that could not be bought, dignity that refused to bend, even in the presence of temptation. He replayed the girl's words in his mind. "We take nothing that isn't ours." She had spoken with a certainty that few adults carried, echoing a lesson her mother had clearly instilled again and again. And when Amara had tugged the blanket over him, treating him with care despite his silent contempt, Richard felt a sting deeper than any insult. For the first time in years, he recognized the mirror he had avoided. It wasn't Gloria he had been testing. It was humanity itself, and he had been desperate to prove his own cynical view of the world correct. But in that single night, an 8-year-old child had dismantled decades of suspicion with an act of kindness so simple, it left him breathless. His chest tightened as memories resurfaced. Boardroom deals where he assumed partners would cheat. Friendships abandoned at the first sign of doubt. Employees scrutinized as though loyalty could never exist. His wealth had insulated him, yes, but it had also poisoned him with distrust. Watching Gloria and Amara leave the room with nothing, but their pride intact, Richard realized the thief in the house was not them. It was him. He had stolen their dignity in his mind long before giving them the chance to prove otherwise. When he finally opened his eyes, the glitter of the watch and the bulge of the wallet mocked him. They had been meaningless bait. What mattered was the lesson that could no longer be ignored. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, but Richard's mind was still trapped in the shadows of the night before. He rose slowly, staring at the untouched wallet, the watch gleaming exactly where he had left it, and the slightly crooked blanket Amara had pulled over him. For the first time in years, the symbols of his wealth felt hollow. At breakfast, Gloria moved quietly through the kitchen, placing his plate in front of him as she always did. Amara sat at the corner of the table with her crayons, sketching a crooked little house surrounded by flowers. Neither of them looked at him with resentment, though they had every reason to if they knew the truth. They had been tested like suspects in their own workplace, their character questioned without cause, and yet they remained graceful, as though dignity was the only treasure they carried with them. Wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words stuck. How could he explain that he had doubted the very foundation of their humanity? How could he admit that the test was never about them, but about his own inability to believe in goodness? He did the only thing he could manage. He raised their pay, expanded Gloria's responsibilities, and later set aside a scholarship fund for Amara. On paper, it looked like generosity, but in truth, it was penance. No amount of money could repay the lesson they had given him freely, that trust is not earned through suspicion, but through respect. That night, lying once again in his bed, Richard realized his wealth had blinded him to something priceless: integrity, honor, the quiet strength of a mother teaching her child to rise above temptation in a world that often expected less of her because of the color of her skin. And as he closed his eyes, one thought echoed louder than any boardroom victory. What kind of world would we live in if more people like Gloria and Amara were trusted instead of tested?